My sister and Mia are going to live here starting today." "What do you mean?" "I didn't hear about this." "Is there a problem with the two of them living here?" "If your mom isn't living here yet, there's room available, isn't there?" When I told Robert about my mom's plan to buy an apartment, something felt off inside me. Having Sandra and Mia live here was unexpected, and sharing the same space with them was a burden for me. I felt like I was only there to silently take care of household duties, as if it were a given. "If you don't listen to Robert properly, he'll throw you out." Sandra threatened me, but I stood my ground. I don't mind being thrown out. Besides, I'm already separated from Robert. What? I had already submitted the divorce papers when Robert was drunk. The apartment is in my mother's name. Robert and Sandra were desperate to convince me to let them stay in the apartment. However, the decision my mother and I came to was, I am Hillary Manning, aged 50. I have devoted myself to homemaking and childcare, supporting the growth of my children as a housewife all these years. I got married right after graduating from college. Blessed with 2 children, I enjoyed the busy yet fun days. Both of my children are now adults and living independently. My husband is also 50 and works at a well-known major company. He has always appreciated my role in the household, saying, "I'll leave the home to you." My husband is a bit prideful, occasionally speaking to me condescendingly. Though his attitude can be grating, the sense of security from having a reliable husband outweighed these moments. My father ran a hospital, and my mother worked as the head nurse there. Though my parents both worked and didn't spend much time together with me, I loved them dearly. My father passed away in his mid-60s due to illness. My mother deeply regretted my father's early death. If only I had paid more attention to his health and insisted he take breaks. If I hadn't let him overwork, he might have lived longer. Perhaps because of my father's death, my mother often told me that it was my job to look after the family's well-being. When I considered taking up a part-time job after my children grew up, my mother said, "I'll support you financially, so don't worry about it." Robert shared the same view as my mother, so I never worked outside the home. Instead, I focused on maintaining our family's well-being while managing household chores and childcare. My mother, being a head nurse, earned more than her peers and led a frugal life, despising wasteful spending. As I grew older, I found myself becoming more like my mother in being thrifty. Now that I am a mother, my husband's salary is sufficient for our needs. With them busy working, I often ended up cooking dinner, which naturally improved my culinary skills. My cooking was well received by the family. Because of this, we rarely ate out, which was a great help to our household budget. We lived peaceful days with my family. However, as the years passed, I began to notice a gradual change in Robert's attitude. When Sandra, Robert's sister, who is 2 years older than us, moved nearby, I felt his behavior changed significantly. Currently supporting herself through part-time jobs, Sandra had just moved in with her 20-year-old daughter Mia after a recent divorce. Sandra had left home due to her parents' disapproval of her marriage, making it difficult for her to return easily. Amidst this, Sandra often sought Robert's advice. Robert, concerned for his only sister, was very attentive to her. At that time, I was also concerned about Sandra and Mia and how they would manage their lives. When Mia's parents got divorced, she quit university. Without looking for a job, Mia flitted from one part-time job to another. When we heard the two were moving, we willingly helped out and even partially funded their moving expenses. From that time, a rift began to grow between Robert and me. I had my doubts about supporting Sandra, but Robert seemed completely unaware of my feelings. Lately, he always talked about Sandra, clearly very worried about her and Mia's life. I have to support my struggling sister. I began to hear such words from Robert quite often. Robert's visits to Sandra's home increased, and he often stayed late drinking with her. Feeling neglected as Robert prioritized Sandra, I felt lonely. As usual, when Robert returned from drinking at Sandra's home, I teased him by showing him the divorce papers. "Did you go drinking at Sandra's house again? Why don't you just divorce me and live there? Maybe you're right. Should I just sign this?" Drunk, Robert wasn't thinking straight and began to sign his name on the divorce papers. Despite being drunk, I was left speechless with surprise and confusion. In the morning, Robert acted as if nothing had happened, going about his usual routine. However, I was harboring a great deal of anxiety. The thought that he might continue to prioritize Sandra's life over mine, possibly leading to irreversible consequences, grew stronger each day. So, I decided to have a serious talk with Robert. I told him that I understood his desire to help Sandra and that I wasn't trying to negate that feeling, but I wanted him to also cherish me. I carefully chose my words, hoping we could reevaluate our relationship. "I understand that your sister is going through a tough time, but do you really need to go this far? I wish you'd care about me as much as you do about her." "Why do I have to hear this?" Robert's expression darkened. "Isn't it too much for her to rely on you just because she's divorced? Have you forgotten that I exist?" My words struck a nerve, and Robert suddenly became furious, slamming the table. Then his face turned bright red, and he began to shout angrily, "How would a housewife like you understand my sister's struggles? How can you even say that?" With that, he stormed out of the house. I wondered if I had gone too far, but I was furious that Robert could dismiss me like this. I had always put my family first, and his words felt like a denial of all I had done, tightening around my heart. The frustration and sadness overwhelmed me, and before I knew it, tears were flowing. Having devoted my days to homemaking, I felt utterly lost about why I had been trying so hard. Robert's attitude, constantly taking Sandra's side without understanding my feelings, was deeply disappointing. I assumed he was probably heading to Sandra's place even now. I was at a loss about how to deal with Robert going forward, or how we should proceed as a couple. Standing there, overwhelmed by my emotions, I could do nothing. The next morning, I calmed myself down and decided to have a proper discussion with Robert, so I headed to Sandra's house. Upon arriving, I pressed the intercom. Waiting nervously, it was Mia who came out, not Sandra. "Aunt Hillary, what's up?" Thinking Sandra might be at work, I asked Mia about Robert. "Robert hasn't come back, didn't he come here?" "Uncle Robert?" "I don't remember much from last night because I drank too much." "Is this his shoe?" Mia pointed to a shoe that was unmistakably Robert's among several scattered around the entrance. From the state of the entrance alone, I could tell the house was quite messy. After waiting a while, Sandra came out from the back. "Hillary? What are you doing here at this hour?" "Sandra, I thought you were here. Robert hasn't come home, so I wondered if he might be here." Sandra, who had just woken up, sleepily glanced at the clock. "It's this late already? I didn't realize. I'll call Robert, just wait a moment." Contrary to Robert's words of concern for his sister, Sandra's casual demeanor was somewhat deflating. Urged by Sandra, Robert appeared and immediately became angry upon seeing me. "Why are you here?" "Why not? You didn't contact me, and I was worried. Have you been drinking too much? Both of you smell like alcohol, and look how messy this place is." Seeing their state, my anger surged. Wondering what he had been so worried about, Sandra responded to my words with a retort. "Hillary, you have no right to say that to us." "That's right. What happens here isn't your business, Auntie." Mia also argued back in the same vein. "How can you say it's none of my business? Robert has been coming here every day, getting drunk." No one took my words seriously. Robert, exasperated, coldly said to me, "What's wrong with me drinking here? Sandra and Mia are my family too, and there's nothing wrong with looking after them." No one was willing to listen seriously to me, and they treated me as if I were in the wrong. I had come here hoping to have a calm discussion, but in this situation, I felt that saying anything more was futile. "It's a waste of time to talk any further." "Excuse me." When I actually visited Sandra's house, it didn't look like she was struggling as much as Robert had said. In fact, it seemed she was living a more comfortable life than before. I couldn't help but feel a dissonance seeing the two of them. With complex emotions in my heart, I headed to my parents' house. Upon arriving, my mother warmly welcomed me. Trying not to surprise her with a sudden visit, I had contacted her on the way, but she was still slightly startled by my rare visit. Nevertheless, the moment I saw my mother's kind smile, tears welled up in my eyes again. My mother noticed my distressed appearance and asked with concern, "Did you have a fight with Robert? You look like you're about to cry." Unable to hold back, I spilled out all the frustrations that had built up in my heart. After listening quietly to my story, my mother suggested that putting some distance between myself and Sandra might be one approach. "I've kept it a secret, but I've been thinking about buying an apartment with the money I've saved up. You could live there." "Really? I had no idea. Where are you looking?" "There's a luxury residential area a bit away from here, and I'm really interested in an apartment there. It would be away from Sandra's place, which might be a good environment for putting some distance between us." "Is that so? I'd like to see that apartment myself." Pleased by my mother's unexpected suggestion, I immediately sent an email to Robert. I was still upset from our previous argument, so I was a bit scared to call him. Robert seemed surprised by the message about possibly living in a luxury apartment and called me right away. "What do you mean we could live in a luxury apartment? My mother is thinking about buying an apartment. She might live with us in the future. What do you think? She's also willing to help with the costs. If it's not right away, I think that's fine." While we were talking on the phone, my mother spoke up from behind me. "Don't worry about me, you two should live there." Robert, hearing my mother's voice, seemed pleased, even over the phone. I felt a bit uncomfortable with his reaction. Later, the purchase of the apartment went smoothly, and we moved without any issues. Soon after, the discomfort I felt became a reality in front of me. While organizing the boxes that arrived at the apartment, I noticed some items that I definitely hadn't sent. Confused by the unexpected situation, I nervously asked Robert, "This isn't something I sent. Do you know anything about it?" Right as I asked, the intercom rang. Looking at the monitor, I saw Sandra and Mia. "We're here. Robert told us to come." "Why are Sandra and Mia here?" I was frozen in place, not understanding what was happening. As I stood there, Robert opened the door, and they entered. "This place is great. The view is amazing. Robert, it's incredible you bought an apartment in such a prime location." They said this while looking excited and having fun. Seeing this, my confusion only deepened. "Robert, can you explain what's going on?" When I asked with a puzzled look, Robert answered nonchalantly, "My sister and Mia are going to live here starting today." "What do you mean? I haven't heard anything about this. Is there a problem with them living here? If your mother isn't here yet, there are spare rooms, aren't there? Hillary, were you planning to live here with your mother? It's insensitive to move in as a daughter-in-law. Sandra, haven't you heard? This apartment is." Just as I was about to explain to Sandra, Robert interrupted. "Can't we talk about this stuffy stuff later? What is Robert thinking? What did he tell them to make them think they could live together like this? They probably think Robert bought the apartment, not knowing my mother did." I felt a surge of anger at Robert's reckless behavior. However, I reminded myself to stay calm. "I'll be staying at my parents' house for a while, so please make yourselves at home." With that, I left the house. Feeling unsettled, I went back to my parents' house and told my mother everything. My mother and I decided to make Robert and the others see the consequences of their actions. A few days later, I visited the apartment to check on things. I saw Sandra and Mia acting as if they owned the place. The apartment was a mess. It seemed no one had cleaned it since I left. "Hillary, welcome back. The house is a mess because you weren't here. If you don't clean, this is what happens." Why haven't you cleaned? Cleaning is your job, Hillary. It would be wrong for us to take that away from you. Sandra said mockingly as Robert came in. How long will you keep running back to your parents? What are you thinking, leaving the house like this? There's a backlog of chores, so get them done. Sandra nodded as if agreeing with him. If you don't listen to Robert, he'll throw you out. Sandra threatened me, but I stood my ground. I don't mind being thrown out. Besides, I'm already separated from Robert. What? Robert and Sandra looked at each other in surprise. What are you talking about, Hillary? What do you mean you're separated from me? I haven't been consulted about your sister and her daughter moving in here. So I decided to go ahead with the divorce without consulting you. A divorce isn't something you can just decide on your own. Robert seemed to have no recollection of drunkenly signing the divorce papers. However, Robert's name was clearly written on the divorce form. I added my own name, submitted the form, and the divorce was finalized. When I discussed it with my mother at her house, she supported the decision to divorce Robert. She too was fed up with Robert's behavior and understood that staying together would only bring more suffering. When I explained to Robert the circumstances under which the divorce papers were filed, his expression changed drastically. Did we really get divorced? What are we going to do now? What do you mean? What are we going to do? This apartment was bought by my mother, so you will need to leave. What are you talking about? Sandra and Mia's expressions also changed as they listened. Leave? Wasn't this apartment bought by Robert? Is it true that Hillary's mom bought it? Didn't Uncle say he bought it with his money? Faced with their barrage of questions, Robert looked down, unable to respond. He must have lied about buying it himself to save face. He hadn't anticipated that being confronted with a divorce would mean he'd have to leave. Indeed, Robert worked at a major company, but not everyone there is on the elite track. I knew from a friend, who happens to be the wife of one of Robert's colleagues, that he was not on the elite track. In fact, Robert's salary was one of the lowest among his peers. I had managed his salary well and saved up enough, enabling us to live comfortably even without me working. Unaware of these facts, Sandra and Mia looked dissatisfied. Regardless, I continued, that's how it is, so please pack your belongings and leave by the end of the week. Can you give us a bit more time? It's hard to find a house in just 1 week, and we really should discuss the divorce properly. Robert was begging desperately, a pitiful sight. A week might be too short, especially since it might be hard for your sister to rely on her family. I said it almost spitefully, as if to get back at them for everything. To give them time, I decided to stay at my parents' house for a while. After a week, I visited them again to discuss further. To avoid any deadlock in the conversation, I asked my mother to be there too. My mother wasn't particularly upset about Robert attempting to live in the apartment with Sandra and Mia. However, she was furious that he hadn't consulted me despite the apartment being in her name and was enraged by his selfish actions. Seeing my mother's anger, Robert kept apologizing profusely. The house was much cleaner than when I had visited previously. It's been a while, Mother. I'm not sure if you'll like it, but please have some tea and snacks. Robert had even prepared coffee and sweets in an effort to appease my mother. It was clear he had told Sandra and Mia to behave respectfully toward my mother. Such actions couldn't excuse how they had treated me before. Despite Robert's superficially polite behavior, my mother started the conversation with a smile, but then spoke her mind. You're being asked to leave this house, and such offerings are too little too late. I didn't mean to divorce Hillary for real. It was just a talk when I was a bit drunk. I'd like to continue living here. Did he really think we could start over? Was he just afraid of losing the apartment? My mother retorted. You intend to continue living here together? I know how you've belittled Hillary for all she's done for the family, managing the household and childcare. Hearing my mother's words, Robert glared at me. Are you tattling to your parents like a child about our marital arguments? I can't believe you discuss such things with your parents. That's why you're said to not understand the hardships of society, Sandra interjected. At this, my mother's face turned dark with anger and she shouted, "Don't you dare interrupt." Startled by my mother's intensity, Sandra momentarily stopped speaking. However, Sandra couldn't back down easily and began to argue back. "If you're telling me to be quiet, shouldn't you also keep quiet? Isn't this a matter between Robert and Hillary?" "Why do you always talk like that, Sandra?" I shot back strongly. Sandra, as an older sister, should not be criticizing others. "Do you think I don't know what kind of life you really lead, Sandra? What real life are you talking about? I heard from Robert that you were juggling several part-time jobs, but that's not true, is it? You sleep till noon and then go to the casinos, don't you?" Surprised by where I had learned this, Sandra was at a loss for words. Robert listened incredulously. "Is what Hillary's saying true? Weren't you struggling with your security job because it was tough?" Sandra, looking down, replied, "I was sleeping while working late, so they let me go." I was astonished to hear for the first time why Sandra quit her job. It was shockingly irresponsible. Since then, Sandra seemed to have repeated problems such as being late for interviews and complaining about the hourly wage while looking for other part-time jobs. As a result, she ended up in her current sloppy lifestyle as she couldn't find anywhere to work. Robert listened to this with a stern face throughout. It seemed he was annoyed to have been lied to by Sandra. My mother thought enough was enough and turned towards Robert to change the subject. "Robert, everyone, whether a homemaker or someone who works outside, does something respectable. It's a big mistake to think only those who earn money face hardships." I felt like crying at my mother's words. She wasn't wrong. I had worked hard at housework and childcare, struggling but earnestly trying to protect my family. Unlike company employees who have days off, I also manage school activities for the children and relations with relatives on top of everything else. My mother continued. "Even from my perspective, Hillary has done a commendable job as a homemaker. A husband who cannot appreciate that is failing his duties." My mother's words weighed heavily on Robert. Being faced with such a valid argument, he had no room for defense. "You lack understanding of a homemaker's life, and I don't see how you can comprehend Hillary moving forward. Divorce seems to be the only option. Does this mean I can't live here anymore?" Robert's voice trembled slightly. My mother began speaking in a calmer tone. "If you want to live here, there's a condition. You need to transfer the apartment's deed to your name and take care of the mortgage. Then, there shouldn't be any problem." The three of them were surprised by such a proposal from my mother but soon smiled. "Please let us do that. I will take responsibility for the payments." "Robert, that's great. Now, you don't have to move. I've been bragging about this house to my friends, so I'm relieved we don't have to leave." The three of them were innocently happy. They didn't realize what reality awaited them, thinking they had secured the house like a trophy. Afterward, I decided to live with my mother at her house. For now, we plan to transfer the apartment's deed from my mother to Robert and discuss the property handling later. A while later, Robert called my mobile. Since that incident, I hadn't wanted any contact with him, and I could guess why he was calling. I ignored the phone. However, as he kept calling persistently, I felt I had no choice but to answer. Right from the start, Robert's shouting filled my ear. "Why aren't you answering after I called so many times? And what's with the mortgage amount? You were the one who agreed to change the deed and take over the payments? I didn't know about the $4,000 mortgage. There's no way I can pay that much." When planning my revenge against Robert together with my mother, I had anticipated Robert's desire for the luxury apartment, so I had only paid a down payment of $10,000. Since I had no intention of reconciling with Robert, I had told my mother to pay the minimum possible down payment. "Since Sandra is there, why don't the two of you split it? I can't ask my sister to do that." According to Robert, Sandra and Mia were still living off his salary without learning their lesson. They wanted to dress appropriately for their prestigious address and kept making Robert pay for their branded purchases. Despite repeatedly telling Sandra to find a stable job, she not only refused but also made excuses for not working. Being a homemaker is a real job too. Didn't Hillary's mother say that? I had to laugh at Sandra's convenient interpretation of my mother's words. That was a context meant for those married and managing households, not quite the same for divorced Sandra. Robert, as if seeking help, pleaded with me. Can you ask your mother for some financial assistance, even a little? Why should my mother help? Ask your own parents. Don't involve me or my family. Don't say things like that. Frustrated, I ended the call abruptly. All that remained was to proceed with the division of assets. With no income of his own, the property settlement would only add to Robert's financial burdens, making his future even more difficult. This was the result of Robert underestimating me. Unable to depend on anyone, Robert continued to struggle with the mortgage payments. Meanwhile, Sandra and Mia's spending habits remained unchanged, with Sandra still not working and going to casinos. When she won at casinos, she spent all her money on her favorite brands. Every time Robert asked for my mother's help, he also shared his troubles, which I had no intention of listening to. No matter how much he pleaded, I had no intention of helping Robert. Impatient, Robert had apparently told Mia to earn money by working at a nightclub if she wanted to keep living in the apartment. This led to a huge argument between him and Sandra, escalating to the point where the police were called to their home. Unable to make further mortgage payments, the three decided to give up their life in the luxury apartment. By that time, it seems the mortgage payments had been missed for 4 months. I felt a bit sorry for the pitiful trio, thinking that if they had realized their limits sooner, they could have made this decision earlier. Now, the three of them are living separately. Since I have settled the property division with Robert, I likely won't have to see or talk to him again. Nor will I have anything to do with Sandra or Mia. I felt a sense of relief and clarity in my heart. After divorcing Robert, I had resumed my studies in nutrition. I had studied to become a registered dietitian in college and had already obtained my license. Even after getting married, I continued my studies whenever I had time. Now, after the divorce, I truly appreciate the value of this qualification. I had never worked as a dietitian before, but I always made sure our daily meals were nutritious. I am now looking to work somewhere I can make use of this qualification. Fortunately, my mother still keeps in touch with a nurse who worked at my father's hospital, and I heard they were looking for a dietitian. With my mother's introduction, I started working for the first time after turning 50. Although I am sometimes bewildered by my first job, I am enjoying a fulfilling life. I also accumulated a year of practical experience and passed the national exam to become a registered dietitian. Seeing me now, my mother mentions how great it would have been if we could turn back time a little. However, I believe that everything happens for the best, so I feel that now is the perfect timing for me to work as a registered dietitian. Having experienced marriage and divorce, I feel that my life has gained depth and my personal breadth as a human being continues to expand.